Okay, it is 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Nutrient webinar on how to choose renewable natural gas partners. As a reminder, this is the second webinar in our series of a 4-part series on renewable natural gas opportunities for farms. Quickly, my name is Jamie Vandermolen. I work with Nutrient, and we are a company that helps farms identify ways to reduce their environmental footprint in the most economically viable way. We always say we know that first part is easy. There are a lot of technologies and options and things that exist today. It's that second part of finding and making the economics work that is the real challenge. So renewable natural gas and the markets that's created is one opportunity that we're looking at and looking forward to talking to you more about that today. A quick thank you to our sponsors at EPA AgStar. We've been working with them for a few years now, and they've been a really great partner. They help farms and others advance manure anaerobic digestion and manure management practices, and also assist through a variety of resources that they have available on their website. So they have a database of digesters that are out there, as well as a lot of resources that help farms identify how they can take advantage and move into this opportunity. One of them, which we're working through today, is their project development handbook. So this entire series is really based around that handbook that walks farms through how to get started on a project like this from start to finish. We have an awesome lineup of speakers today who you'll hear from in just a few minutes, but wanted to quickly cover what we're going to talk through today. So we talked a couple of weeks ago on the first webinar about, are you a good fit, or is your farm a good fit for an RNG project? Today, we're going to move into what happens after you find out your farm is a good fit for a project like this. What are the steps you need to start to take? One of the first ones is selecting what might be the right business model for you and your farm. So we have a speaker that will talk to, the various different business models and how you can start to weigh the different risks and rewards associated with those business models. We'll also hear from John Larson, who is a farmer in Florida, who is working through a project now and is happy to share his experience there. And then lastly, how do you prepare for potential partners and contracts? So we'll talk a little bit about the different resources. When do you need to start seeking advice and information from external help, like legal advice? Quickly, to cover off on kind of why we're talking about this and why we created a series around this, and something we covered in the last webinar. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to go back. Our recording is available on Nutrient's website. But what are really the drivers of these renewable energy projects? So we spent some time talking about this on the last webinar, including the state incentive programs, like the one many of us hear about today, and the one that's driving a lot of the projects that we see coming across the pipeline is the LCFS credit out of California. So a lot of these projects are coming out of that opportunity from the West. National programs and incentives, consumer demand that exists. We know consumers are demanding more sustainable products. And other, external sectors are looking to green their portfolios. So a lot of these new opportunities are arising for farms. And then also any farmer's interest in just diversifying the revenue stream as we look in the future. What are the different opportunities to look into these long-term and short-term markets that exist to help farms diversify their revenue stream? Also on the last webinar, we spent a lot of time talking about the different technologies and types of digesters that exist today and what might be a good fit from your farm, but also spent more time on the considerations that each farm needs to think about before they look into this opportunity. So are you committed to long-term business relationships? Have you talked about a succession plan? What is the amount of risk you want to talk about, which we'll get into more today? Do you want to own the project or manage the project or operate it? We talked about a lot of these different questions and considerations that each farm should think through and have conversations about before approaching this RNG opportunity. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mark Storman, who will talk about some basic tips to prepare your farm for RNG partners. Go ahead and take it from here, Mark.
Thanks, Jamie. If you could advance the slide. My job is really kind of easy. I'm just going to ask you to consider, before you're going into a project, what in your mind makes a good project and what makes a good partner. And some of the things to think about as you're looking at these opportunities with RNG developers and all the options in front of you is, where would you like to see this 5 years from now? what would be an ideal situation, and work toward that ideal. Unfortunately, in a lot of these projects, good projects don't happen because somebody gets too greedy. Sometimes it's a developer who isn't willing to share with the farm. Sometimes it's a farm that just simply wants too much, and that's unfortunate. But I would just encourage you to consider what you want out of a project. And then at the same time, and I actually tell people, get up out of your chair at your desk, go to the other side of the desk, sit down and say, all right, if I was doing the other side of this deal, would I accept what I'm asking for? And you want to be working together, both in an honest and straightforward way. And you should be able to expect that of each other. And at the same time, in good projects, the partners are looking out for each other. You should be looking out for those people that are going to be working with you in a long-term relationship. Partner has a legal connotation to it, but even if it's not a true partnership, even if you're working on and owning it and hiring people to do this, it could potentially be a long-term relationship at any rate. And you want to make sure it's a good relationship. And you want to make sure that when you sign agreements and when you look at agreements and you're talking to others, that you're working with people who share your same values and are willing to give you the same sort of deals in agreements as they want. And I've looked at a few of the project, letters of intent and things like that, where everything is on the developer side. The developer can cancel it without notice. The developer can, extend it without notice. Everything goes to the developer. And I quite, honestly encourage farms to and producers to look at those documents and go back and say, well, if you have the right to cancel this at any time for any reason, then I should have that right. And so I think in a lot of those cases, you want things to be mutual and you want things to be fair. At the same time, fair is, giving people enough time to do their due diligence and to get the work done. And I think as we talk more about what goes into a project today, you're going to hear some things that really encourage you to look at those sort of parameters. But as Jamie said, this is a long way of saying that, you should really keep the golden rule and treat others like you want to be treated. Hopefully we can move beyond that, give you also some other good advice. And with that in mind, I'm going to pass this on to the next speaker.
All right, we're going to turn it over to Jordan. Before he gets started, just want to remind everyone, if you have questions as we move through the speakers, please feel free to type that into the Q&A and we'll keep an eye on those and try to either type back a response or ask those live at the end. If we don't get to all the questions, we always do type up the answers and send them back out to everyone who attended. Go ahead, Jordan. You're on mute. There you go.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. And thank you, Mark. My name is Jordan Hamiden. I've been working with farms probably for 20 years in one capacity or another, and I'm also an energy lawyer. So my clients are energy-related companies and farms by and large, working on everything from permitting to construction to now these RNG projects. I was lucky enough to be on the front end here in Wisconsin. I'll tell you, one very interesting fact I think is important for everybody to understand. And I think, if I remember right, the source for this is EPA AgStar. But as of April of this year, there were only 22 projects that were actually receiving revenue from the LCFS program, which is astounding given how much activity is going on out there. And of those 22 projects, 15 of them were in Wisconsin. So this very much is a make it up as you go, sort of wild, wild west subject here. And as Mark was saying, you really have to go into it with eyes wide open as things are developing. Could I have the next slide, please? So EPA AgStar handbook tells us there's several different 4 different business models that are possible for the RNG. I left one of them out, and I'll get to that in a minute, but this builds off of that and maybe departs from it a little bit based on my experience. I think I've negotiated probably 20 of these deals now. But I think what you're looking at here on the top is what I'll call a risk continuum, with most risk being the owner business model, middle being the partner, and then the least risk being the supplier. So in an owner model, the farm owns the project, develops and owns the project, ultimately has responsibility for that, and then operates the project. Now, of course, as Mark Sturman said the other day, if you're going to be the owner of one of these projects, you're opening a new business, and it's not dairy farming. It's a brand new business, and it's gas manufacturing and gas sale according to the rules of a very particular program or programs. So you're going to have to, as an owner, you're going to have to develop the project. You're going to have to find people who know what they're doing to build these facilities. You're going to have to negotiate with the gas company to find an injection point. You're going to have to negotiate and come to terms with a marketing agent who's going to make sure that the RNG has a contract path out to California or to whatever program you're participating in, and that there's an off-taker for that gas. You're also going to have to worry about transport and things like that. Now, partner, and I think this is kind of the sweet spot if people can do it. But let me go back to owner. I will tell you, of the 20 or so deals I've been involved in, only one involves a farm that developed the project themselves, and they did it on balance sheet, so they didn't borrow money for it. It was all their own equity, and they did it. They got it done, but they had some very, very well-paid management at the farm who had extensive experience in project development before, which I think, in addition to their equity, made it possible for them to step in those shoes. As far as I know, that project's going well. I check in from time to time, and they've had some road bumps, don't get me wrong, but it's successful and it can be done. Beware, however, I would advise dairy farms, beware of folks coming around saying, hey, we'll develop this project for you. Because those folks who aren't going to be owners and want to develop a project for you, probably haven't done it before because it's not a widely used model. And, you're going to have a lot of sort of, this is the first time you're doing any of these things for them and for you. So just be careful. The sweet spot, I think, is number 2, where you're a partner, because I think that maximizes, and I mean partner in the legal sense, where you're going to partner up with the owner of these facilities, where essentially the owner gives you an opportunity to invest in their project. In this way, you're not just a supplier of manure or biogas, you are an actual owner of the project, but in these structures, you're not going to have a big say in how the project operates. You're just going to be entitled to the economic benefits of the project in exchange for a rather large infusion, up to something around 50%, depending on what the development company wants to do in terms of a partner. The least risk is going to be the supplier option, where if you have a digester already, you're going to be supplying gas to the project company so they can get it out to California or what have you and start earning revenue on it. I will tell you, there's probably not a whole lot of you on this webinar that have digesters that haven't signed some kind of an agreement already. That's what I call the low-hanging fruit, and a lot of that's already been plugged. So if you're going to be a supplier under this ownership model, it's probably going to be as a manure supplier, and basically that's the limit. You're going to supply a constant stream of manure in order to maximize revenue, and there are a number of different compensation structures that are beyond the scope of this webinar today. But you see everything from, hey, we'll pay you, a certain amount per gallon, we'll say, pay you a certain amount of the profits of the company, we'll pay you a certain amount per energy unit that gets injected into the pipeline. So a lot of the key considerations you're going to have when you try to make the decision about what the right business model is for your farm among these three is, what does your balance sheet look like? Are you going to be able to get financing? Now, November 10th, we're going to be talking about that in a little bit more detail. But that's a huge consideration is how much can your balance sheet withstand in terms of borrowing money and having liabilities? Do your mortgage covenants even allow you to do something like this? Are you going to have to collateralize things that you'd rather not collateralize or are not able to under these mortgage covenants? You know, what's the current status of your farm? If you have a digester, you're closer to the money, and being an owner may be a better and less expensive option for you. One thing I think about every time I do one of these deals, and I will tell you, most of my work has been on behalf of farmers. I've represented some developers. The developers I've represented tend to be the ones that come to the middle pretty quickly with the farms and aren't the real aggressive developers. And I tend to make their agreements more farm friendly. But, you know, what I think about a lot is, you know, I'm talking to the owner of the farm now, but what's this farm going to be like in 20 years? What's the plan? What's the transition plan of this farm? And what does that mean in terms of what business model they ought to be looking at? And that includes, you know, the potential sale of the farm down the road. There's a lot of things that can sort of hobble the sale of a farm. You want to make sure that this agreement enhances the value of the farm, that your business model does, and not detracts from it. The other thing is operational and investment risk. I mean, as an owner, you're going to make tons more money on the project than as the supplier, but there's price risk, there's technology risk, and there's regulatory risk. And you have to think very carefully about whether you want to take that on. Last thing I'll talk about on this slide is the hub and spoke. EPA AgStar lists that as one of the business models, and it is, but what that means is, are you going to participate as the hub of a project that uses a lot of other farms and brings the manure or gas in from other farms to be processed? Or are you going to be one of the spokes and just provide maybe thickened manure or manure by pipeline to that hub? Either way, whether you're a hub or a spoke, you have these three choices. Generally, these three choices as to what business model you choose. So that wraps up this part of it for me. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jordan, in walking through those considerations, and we'll hear more from Jordan in just a few minutes. Before we do, I wanted to introduce John Larson. We're lucky to have him on the call today, and he's way far south of Wisconsin, down in Florida, at Larson Dairy Farm near Okeechobee, Florida. And they broke ground, I think it's been, John, close to a year now that you broke ground on this project, if I remember right, maybe last November. And working on implementing new digesters. He has sent along some photos that I'll show as we talk through some questions and answers with him, but provided a ton of environmental benefits. And he's worked through this process now for the last kind of year plus, and thought it would be helpful to hear from him on his experience in starting to think about this project, what conversations he had from the beginning, how he was kind of approached by different developers, and how he ultimately made it to kind of that break ground point, and how things are going today. So if you don't mind, John, I'll flip through some of your farm photos, which are awesome, as we talk along. But if you can kind of start with, you know, what did those initial conversations a year, you know, close to a year ago now start to look like? Were you as a farm did you feel prepared to have conversations with developers when you were first approached? Did you at that time kind of like understand the full value that you had as a farmer to participate in an opportunity like this? And talk a little bit about what those initial conversations looked like.
Well, thank you, Jamie. It's good to be with y'all today. You know, actually, it was probably close to 2 years when the actual first communications was taking place, and it actually happened from a county commissioner in a neighboring county that was very influent in the economic council in parts of Florida and whatnot. And he knew of, actually knew my brother that was a president at that time of the Florida Cattlemen's Association. He knew it was dairy farms. And so they asked to set up a meeting with us. And through our years, in the past 10 years of succession planning, we actually split Larson Dairy Inc. into like 3 different companies. At that time, my father was still very much involved at that time. And we felt like we have family in different companies. So we kind of have our own thing, but we do a lot of things still under one roof. So we went in with this thing with the idea that 2 of the 3 companies that are mostly freestall housing would be entertaining the idea. And when this man came in to talk with us about it, I did not know this particular company at that time. They were relatively, I guess, new in doing some of these renewable projects. And we started talking with them, but at the same time, being on the DMI board, I also was familiar with our Nutrient LLC and some of the things to be looking for. Well, it seemed like a rapid wave all of a sudden when several companies within a matter of weeks were contacting us. And we started going through, and they talked about what they could offer as far as a turnkey situation. And be honest with you, at that particular time, we weren't really interested in doing something completely on us. We would be there to help facilitate the project, but they came in and started talking about what they had to bring to the table and what kind of revenue it might generate, what kind of maintenance would be taken care of, and things like this. And then they started talking about, before we get too far into this, they started talking about the CI score. Well, that was pretty non-applicable to me. I didn't really understand, really what the carbon index score was. But I learned a lot of this stuff. And I learned a lot of this stuff because of the Nutrient LLC that the dairy industry has. So that first communication, we bounced around with about 2 or 3 of these vendors. And as we got further into what it was going to detail, I think most farmers are pretty conservative when it talks about their land and what it may take up and how it may alter their normal day-to-day operations. So we were, we were all tuned in there to what they could possibly bring for us. And, we had to kind of look at kind of a cost benefit type thing, even though they are footing the bill basically on the project. But there are some intangibles there, the land occupying during construction for this. This particular picture here is where they were pouring the manure collecting area, where now that's actually 3 weeks ago. So there's actually some separators starting to be put up there now. But as we got into this thing, Jamie, we kind of had to understand where they were coming from. And obviously they had done their homework with us a little bit too, prior to meeting. Number one is they wanted a fair amount of cows in one area. And they also knew that there were existing gas lines under some of our farms already, which really made things pretty advantageous to them to go forth with it. But that's kind of way it kind of started. We just kind of wade through and how we could work with each of these type of vendors and what kind of decisions we asked ourselves and how we thought we could work with them and not alter too much on the way we do things, which was very important. Another big issue was how this would impact us in a nutrient management plan that we already had. And they actually are using the same engineer that actually drew our nutrient management plans that is doing a lot of this project. So he's very familiar with the existing farms. And this details 4 projects on 4 different dairy farms. The 2 of them are right close together, like 2 miles apart, and the other 2 are like within 2 miles apart on basically pretty much a contingent piece of property. But so putting that in perspective, the gas lines are a big advantageous thing for them. They're on site, they're on the farm already. So I didn't even know as a farmer to begin with in this thing early on that methane could be put into regular gas line, LP type gas going to power plants. But as we got into this thing, we learned, and it was a real big help from Mark Storman, really helped cover a lot of technical questions as to where we go from here, what kind of return would they be looking for, and so forth. So,
yeah, that was really helpful. And I appreciate that you named kind of all of the different resources that you sought kind of from the beginning, including helping, help understanding the CI score. And that's something we talk a lot about in the last webinar. So if anyone wants to go back and kind of watch those slides, it's a very complicated score that basically drives the value of the project. Engineers, those to help with nutrient management planning, and then reaching out to Nutrient and other people in the industry to get where this project is today. Can you talk about a little bit, I know we have some pictures of where you were. I think you said this is just like 3 weeks ago, just what that timeline at a high level kind of looked like. You talked about kind of how you got started. What did that next year or so look like, or a year and a half?
well, it took probably, I'm going to say it was probably a 6 to 8 months as we came to terms and come to an agreement of, because there was a due diligence period there that actually was extended a time or two. You have to remember, we were getting right in the middle of COVID, and it held up this project from really getting going because so many things were shut down. But as we finally got up and rolling a little thing, I will tell you, one particular thing held up the liners for like 6 months, and that was the resin. The resin that it takes to make the liners just weren't there. And I understand that the boat manufacturers are running into a lot of the same things. So I think we're kind of overing that, although some of the supply chains are been hampered. What we got there is a manure, kind of a manure stacking pad that will be there. And for people that aren't dealing with moving solids and whatnot, this is going to make you move solids more often. And we move solids, but some of the other units, basically, it just went into storage type lagoons. So it's going to be a little different. There is going to be some challenges there to move and either sell them, move them off farm, or use them on different pastures and cropland or whatever. But I think one of the big things dealing with this particular vendor was they helped with some of the manure handling equipment that's going to be needed for this, because they wanted us to take care of that. So I think that was an important thing to to get their hands around the whole thing that would be working. And somebody's got to be working that's not going to deviate your nutrient management plan. They've got to be very friendly about it. So far, so good on that. It's been very good working relationship. They want to try to minimize the amount of water in the system at the best they can. And that tends to kind of maybe help the CI score. And so there are some things that we can do management wise that probably will actually save us a little money by cutting some water back in uses and whatnot. But I think when it comes down to making a deal before this, the manure supply agreement is, to me, the most critical thing of how this thing comes to being, because I think, number one, the term is a big sticking point for probably a lot of projects. And depending upon how people negotiate what they want, most of these people like 20 or 25 years or 15 or in an option with 5 type years on that. It all depends how you got to weigh where your location is and what kind of potential you may have next to you, what your lineage is in the family business, who may carry some of this on, things like that. You've got to really weigh, but I think they're also looking at an established farm that's been there for some time and numbers of animals that they can get their hands around to make it viable for them. But I really think the term is a big thing that you really got to take some good time and get yourself an environmental attorney that goes through that like a fine-tuned comb on that manure supply agreement, because there's some penalties in there, if you don't perform. But there's also some outs to where if we get a hurricane down here, a catastrophic event that takes us out, that's just an act of God. If the economics and the credits go away, it just doesn't make it viable for their side of things. Well, just like us, the dairy has got to be viable as well. And if things get so bad, in which it has not been very good here on the fluid milk market side of things, that we've got to weigh those things out the best you can and, adjust accordingly to it. But somebody that's willing to work with you is what I've always liked. And I think that's up to the individual vendor dealing with the farmer. Of each farm is a different personality. It just is. So maybe that was some help to you on that, Jamie.
Yeah, no, that was so much help. And I appreciate you being upfront and honest with everyone about some of the challenges that they may experience as they're looking at this, and some of those kind of watch out moments that they need to look at, how they can weigh like where those risks and rewards might be. And also, I think you helped kind of guide people and help them understand what type of resources they need to bring in from the very beginning. So you actually covered everything. I think I was going to ask you, what's the big piece of advice, but I think that your last kind of statement covered that, and looking at that term and making sure you seek people to help you read through what those might be. So really appreciate it. And I think we'll turn it back over to Jordan to keep going. Thanks so much, John.
Okay, thank y'all.
Okay, thanks again, Jamie. If you want to advance it to the next slide, thanks very much. So this part of it, we're talking about the business relationships and agreements. And what I've done is I've broken it down by business model and sort of listed the agreements. Now, these could all vary a little bit depending on the project. Before I start down this road, though, I want to correct something I was mistaken on when I began here. And this is an answer to a good question raised about in the last webinar. It was said that there were only 8 of these projects receiving revenue, and I think I said 22 were receiving revenue as of April. My mistake. The 22 number, what I should have said is that there are 22 of these projects as of April 2021 in the ground. And out of those 22, 15 are in Wisconsin. And that was again as of April. Of the ones in Wisconsin, I can tell you there's only 3 as of April that were receiving revenue. And so I think 8 was the right number. And I just mixed up how many are actually operating right now versus how many are receiving revenue. So good point. Thank you for raising that. But let's get into what agreements do we, yeah.
Excuse me, this is Mark, but actually the latest update on the CARB website shows that there's about 26 dairy projects that have submitted applications or pathways, and that there are 44 swine manure projects that have been submitted. They do not list on the CARB website. That was, by the way, of October 20th of this year. They do not list which ones are generating revenue. So we are somewhat limited in the availability of the information, and the information is constantly being updated. So we apologize that, all the numbers aren't matching. Sometimes you get a hold of an old report, but this is the current CARB data. Is there's 26 dairy projects that have applications in and 44 swine manure projects.
Okay, Mark, that's helpful. And yeah, my information, even as it was, is dated back to April and not super current. But the point of that information is this: this isn't an easy road, and there's a whole lot of activity out there. And the relatively low numbers of those that are in the ground and the applications before the before CAR and so on really highlights just how much needs to be done before you're at the point where you're actually making money on these things. And that's why I raised it. So let's talk about the most risky model, the owner model. As you can see, because the farm is actually taking on the brunt of the risk and the brunt of the responsibility, you're going to have more people to deal with and more agreements to negotiate. The first one's going to be the development agreement. Now, that's not mandatory. Farm can decide that they're going to be the developer themselves, but I can tell you that most farms I've dealt with, if they decided to go with the owner model, they're going to need to hire a developer, and they're going to need to enter into a development agreement so that they're shifting the responsibility to someone else to get the thing developed and built. Among the agreements that the farm will have to enter into, even if they enter into a development agreement, is an energy or a construction, engineering, procurement, construction agreement, EPC agreement, and construction management agreement, just to get the facilities built. If you're talking about a 5,000 cow farm and you have to build, upgraded manure separation equipment, maybe a new lagoon, digester, and renewable natural gas cleaning facility, you're looking at easily $30 to $40 million project there. And so you're going to need somebody to manage that. As the owner, you're also going to need to have an operation and maintenance agreement probably with someone, because a lot of farms, most of the farms I've dealt with, even those that are CAFOs with 5,000 to 10,000 milking, don't have the bandwidth to both milk those and feed those cows, and also to operate and maintain a gas production and delivery business. So you're going to need to probably outsource that. You're going to need to have a marketing agreement through any number of providers who will agree to find an offtake agreement for you, get your gas to market, and take care of the validation that's necessary in order to monetize and get the value of the environmental credits. You're going to have an injection agreement with the pipeline, and that's also going to require some vendor and construction agreements. And then finally, you're going to need transportation agreements, which will cover getting the clean, renewable natural gas over to the pipeline. Now, as Mr. Larson indicated, his projects are very valuable because they were sitting on these natural gas pipelines, but most of them aren't. And I was really surprised to learn that the LCFS revenue potential is high enough that some of these developers were able to justify transporting the RNG 100 miles to get it into the pipeline. I don't know if the current price still supports that, but I just thought that that'd be a fun fact to share. But anyhow, you're going to need transportation agreements to get the gas to where it needs to go to get injected into the interstate pipeline. Now, with the partner model, that becomes a little bit easier, because in a partner model, you're buying into the owner. You're not making the decisions of the owner, and you're not doing all the things that the owner does from an operational and a construction standpoint. You are simply buying into the business. But even doing that, you're going to need a shareholder member agreement, all the corporate agreements that go with being a legal partner. You're probably going to have to enter into a development agreement where you split the responsibility for what things the farm has to do to get ready for the project and what things the developer does. The developer is going to need some land. They're either going to purchase it or they're going to lease it from you. So you're going to have that agreement. You're also going to need an easement agreement, whether or not you sell them the land, so that they have access to that leased area or the purchased area in order to do their business. And then last but not least, in the partner model, you're going to still be the supplier. So you're going to have to enter into a manure supply, or if you have a digester already, into a biogas supply agreement. It gets a little bit easier with the most simple least risk supplier model, where you're going to have to, again, provide the developer a place to live on the farm. That'll be either through leasing them, and most of these campuses are, I'd say, less than 5 acres where this equipment is, and I've seen them as small as 2 acres. But again, you're going to have to lease it to them or let them purchase it. The easement agreement, will go along with that. And for the reasons I just said in the partner model, you're going to have to enter into a manure supply and biogas supply agreement. Now, I just saw a question come over about at what point should you seek legal advice? And I have a very strong feeling on that, not just because I like to get paid as a lawyer, but because I've had so many farmers come to me after already taking certain steps, which if I had been involved for them and advocating for them, the whole thing would have started out better. Look, when they come and talk to you and sit down at your kitchen table, you don't need a lawyer there for that. I think, as John Larson said, they were visited by a lot of people. Hear them out, hear what they have to say. But the first time they give you a piece of paper to sign, that's when you got to get a lawyer involved. And even though it's a letter of intent, and most of them will say this isn't binding, the fact of the matter is that it sets up expectations in people's heads about what the project's going to look like, how much you're going to get paid, so on and so on. And it gets a little bit more difficult to negotiate a developer away from that when it comes time to negotiate what we call the definitive agreements, meaning the agreements that will be binding and the ones that will count. And that's important because these letters of intent, the only binding provisions in them typically are a exclusivity period, meaning you agree you won't talk to any other developer. And number 2, that it'll be in effect, that exclusivity will be in effect for a certain amount of time, often 6 months, sometimes up to a year. I've been pushing it shorter and shorter, but developers need that kind of time to make sure that the project's right for them too. But during that time, you're going to be stuck. So you want to make sure that's right. So the first time they give you these letter of intent or term sheets or what have you, that's the time to visit a lawyer with a lawyer who knows what these agreements are and knows what the risks and knows what the issues are. So even though many farms have great local counsel, it's important to consult with a lawyer who's done these deals before. Also, there are other experts, I think, that ought to be consulted at the very front end. And this is probably before you get your draft letter of intent or term sheet. And those are folks at some of the engineering firms. And if anybody's interested, I can I can consult with you to provide you with some connections. But there are firms who have people who have gotten very, very smart about the RNG space, including engineers and so on, who understand the development of carbon intensity scores. Because as Mr. Larson indicated, that carbon intensity score is going to be the determinant more than anything else about the value of your project. Well, I've always advised my farm clients that they ought to have an independent assessment, even if it's back of the envelope, on what their carbon intensity score is, their CI score, so that they go into these negotiations having a good idea of what value they're bringing to the project. So having answered that question, I think I'll turn it back to you, Jane.
All right, great. And I know we have a couple more questions, so I'll just go ahead and both of you can come off mute, ask that question. This is a kind of multi-part question, but with a strong effort to implement the first low carbon market in the Midwest, Future Fuels Act in Minnesota, do you see an increased interest in development to fulfill this market, especially considering somewhat bureaucratic nature of CARB/LCFS? Mark or Jordan?
Well, I think as we look at the different opportunities that are made available for selling into low carbon fuel standard markets, what you're really seeing is an increase in the demand side of the equation. Whether or not they're all going to be competitive with California, which is an incredibly large market, and they have a very lucrative incentive for developers. Whether all of the state low carbon fuel standards will have that same level of incentive and whether it'll be as valuable to sell in all the states is yet to be seen. But I think the more that you see the development of these, not only, individual state, but regional low carbon fuel standards, the more opportunity there is and the more certainty there is that there will be a place for gas of the various, carbon intensities, and that will find its way into low carbon markets and at least get some sort of incentives. So I'd say it's a positive, but as far as where it will all shake out and whether or not other states will become the preferred state to go into, I think is going to depend on really how those states structure their low carbon fuel standard systems and what kind of revenues they have the potential to bring in.
Great. So in addition to the LCFS-like programs that you just spoke to, do you see any pathway to pressure or partner with pipeline operators like local or regional utilities, so it's more ready to be more readily accepting of RNG?
Well, I'll take a stab at this one, Mark. I agree 100% with Mark on what he said about the Minnesota initiative. I think the proof's in the pudding. I have not done any kind of a deal where anything other than the California LCFS was mentioned. That's where that's where the money is right now. And usually that's matched up with, because you can get both the credits on the LCFS and the RINs under the EPA program, the Renewable Fuel Standard. You can marry those up. So that's where the money is right now. Also, I talked about low-hanging fruit before. Most of the big farms are already in some stage of a deal here. Nothing prevents the developer from switching mid-term from LCFS to some other revenue source. At least none of the agreements I've negotiated restrict them from doing that. And no farmer would want to, because in fact, what I include in the agreements that I negotiate is a term that says you will go after the most lucrative incentive you can find of all of those that are available, particularly when the farm's compensation is based on the revenue of the development company. So I've seen and heard of a lot of these other, in fact, I was on a call with some Wisconsin legislators and other leaders in the industry yesterday, talking about a potential Wisconsin program. But I'll tell you, that's going to be a tough road to hoe as long as LCFS is out there, because there's that's where the greatest demand is right now.
I think the one other thing that is related to the question of, getting in to the pipeline and things like that is the concept of understanding that there are intrastate and intrastate pipelines, and there's different standards for each of them.
Yeah, and more directly to the question, the whole intrastate pipeline issue is that intrastate pipelines, utilities, they don't have to take the gas, and a lot of times there will be a 4-inch line running through a farm. That would be great if we could make an agreement with that local distribution company, LDC we call them, to get the gas in there, and then they can put it in the interstate pipeline, and that just enhances the revenue to the project. But I will tell you, most of these utilities have no incentive to do so, and they're really not interested.
One other thing I'd like to add to what Jordan was saying is it's important, as you have your discussions early on, to understand what the business model is of any developer you're working with. Because we do know, and if you've been watching this space for some time, that there are developers who have made agreements with larger energy producers like Dominion and energy companies like that. And because of that, they may or may not have the ability to go to those most lucrative markets. And so there are companies that are signing deals with local or regional utilities to basically green up their gas portfolio, but that's going to be used within their region and not be taken to California necessarily. And so there are times they can, and there are times they can't. Now you might ask, well, why would you ever not go out to California if you could? Well, one of the uncertainties of the credit market is how long will it actually be around? And California has stated that theirs will be around at least until 2030. There are still some questions around the renewable fuel standard is what happens after 2022, which is what the law set the obligations for. But some of these long-term lease contracts with the utilities are long-term contracts, 20+ years. So you may be giving up a higher premium, but you may be getting a longer duration. And so it's just very important to understand and to have a conversation with whoever you're talking to understand what type of market they'll be selling into and what kind of restrictions that's going to put on the project.
All right. I think we have a couple more questions. I'll flag this one quickly. It's specific to the state of Illinois, but when is Illinois going to implement an LCFS incentive, or other states who maybe don't have one? Is there some signal farms could watch for? And why are there so few digesters in Illinois?
So I'll take a crack at that one, Mark. I don't know the Illinois environment with a whole lot of detail, but I'll tell you generally what I think about states creating or not creating these programs. And that is, there's a certain value of sustainability that has to be there from a political standpoint before they're going to require a program. Because the LCFS program, it's a great revenue source for all these farms, but guess what? Someone's paying for it, right? And who's paying for it? Ultimately, it's the consumer at the pump. I'll tell you, with the legislature we have in Wisconsin right now, I'd never bring a proposal to have Wisconsin consumers paying more at the pump in order to support an environmental program, whatever the benefits of. There's just political realities, I think, in many states which make doing this a little bit problematic, in addition to the fact that California's made it so lucrative because they are so aggressive with their clean fuel standards that few people are going to want to compete with that from a subsidy standpoint.
Great. Thanks for.
Just to extend on that point, it's also got to do with the other revenue streams that you can get from renewable energy. The development of the LCFS and the, heightened interest in renewable natural gas is relatively new and related to relatively big facilities that can have a very significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And so you're not seeing a lot of opportunities for smaller farms and farms that can't necessarily get into an interstate pipeline. And I think that's the case you have in Illinois is you don't have a very high price for other renewables because of, having wind and solar generation that's keeping, electrical prices down, and then not having huge areas of concentration of animal manure to be able to bring together and put projects together. So there's a couple of different factors that are associated, and that's true of many different Midwestern states, certainly.
Okay, great. And just the last minute, can you speak more about digestate and nutrient management? It seems sometimes the RNG digester developer is different from the manure, compost and nutrient technology vendor. Since this all impacts the carbon intensity, are there any good strategies to build a team with all of these considerations a farm has to think about?
Yeah, and that's, I don't want to be in the position of advertising specific folks here, but, there are people I work with on a weekly basis who specialize in that. And I think, along the lines of my advice about who to consult before you go too far down the road of these projects, that's one of the points of consultation I think you should make. I also think it's really important to understand how the digestion process is going to change what the manure looks like that's going to be sitting in your lagoon and then spread on your fields. There were some concerns early on, I haven't seen them substantiated, that the digestate from some of these digesters, and especially the condensate from some of these RNG skids, these biogas upgrade plants, can have chemical characteristics that might accelerate the deterioration of materials in the lagoons, for example. I've never seen proof of that, but that was just an example of a concern that came up that I don't do that. So I pass that to an engineer to deal with the farm. And apparently they came up with some solution or concluded that it was not really going to be a problem. But that is definitely part of the picture, and you have to plan for that.
Awesome. That was a great last question to finish off with. Before we hang up this webinar, I wanted to just share a couple of things. First and foremost, please contact us with any questions that you may have. I'll put our contact slide up at the end in just a minute. We're happy to walk you through what resources exist, how we can help you make decisions, look at contracts, and get you in touch with the right people. So please reach out if you have questions on anything we've shared today. Just to quickly flag, on November 10th, we'll have our third in the series where we will dig deeper into permitting, contracts, and financing the renewable natural gas projects and what you need to know. EPA AgStar, as a reminder, is a great resource. Again, they have a handbook right on their website that walks through from start to finish how you approach one of these projects as a farm. And then I'll leave you with our contact information here up on the slide. Please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we're happy to talk further. All right, thank you to our speakers, and thank you, everyone. Have a good day.